Thanks for everyone holding on for our arrivals. I'm Ben Glover, I'm the Head of Social Policy at the think tank Demos. I'm delighted to be hosting this event today, supported by SIPFO. I'm sure you'll hear more about from Ian later. At Demos, we're running something called the Future Public Services Task Force, which is supported by SIPFO and some great organisations, including Bridges, Outcomes, Partnerships. And it's trying to define what the next era of public service reform should look like. And a big part of that is the question of devolution, and in particular English devolution. English devolution thus far has focused primarily on economic and transport functions, and I'd like us to consider today the question of whether public services should be the next frontier of devolution within England. And I'm delighted we've got a great panel to discuss these issues and topics with us. And to my left, we have Councillor Carol Patterson. Carol is the leader of Kirklees Council. To my right, we've got Jim McMahon-He. Jim is the Minister for Local Government and English Devolution. To Jim's right, we've got Councillor Bev Craig. Bev is the leader of Manchester City Council. And to Carol's left, we have Ian Murray. Ian is the Director of Public Financial Management at SIPFO, who are the kind sponsors of the event today. We've got until about 4 o'clock. We'll have plenty of time for questions, so get your thinking caps on. We're going to hear some opening remarks from the speakers. I'll then maybe ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So without further ado, we're going to go to Jim first to talk us through his thoughts on the question of should public services be the next frontier of English devolution. Jim, thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, the exam question is that they were always meant to be. Public services were always meant to bring together economic growth on one hand and public service reform on the other, recognising that you could not change the economy and society without the two working hand in glove. I think I'll come on to why I don't think that works, maybe kind of late in the contribution. But where we're trying to get ahead, I suppose, is that with this privilege that we have of being in government and being able to work with our mayors and our councils, beginning to really crack one, the legacy that we've inherited, which is holding back communities and large parts of the country to deliver on our missions. Of course, headline one being growth, but to do it in a way that we know will have impact, because in the end, GDP matters, but it doesn't matter at all if you haven't benefited from it. And so we need to make sure that the growth and reform get through to every part of the country. Now, we are keen to see, determined to see, in fact, England taking its rightful place as a first among equals with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, in a way that previously, honestly, devolution here feels like an afterthought. We'll get round to it at some point in the future. At best, it's been quite fragmented, very deal-based, where different areas are constructing their own agreements to bitch for government for additional money and power, but in the end, quite marginal, because we're not changing the structure of how we govern in terms of defining what the role of central government is, what the role of councils as the delivery arm of public services are, and then when we want to create these regional structures, what are they? Are they super councils? Are they mini governments, central governments, or are they something a bit different? And so we're kind of working through that. The English devolution bill will be the platform for that prime legislation, and that will be top to bottom devolution, determined devolution. Of course, it's about shifting power from Westminster to our regions, but it's also about making sure that power goes to every community in the country. So community power and neighbourhood power will be a part of that when it comes forward. Repairing foundations. Devolution will not work if the councils on which it rests are going bust left, right and centre. The financial foundations of local government are mission critical for delivering on the national missions of government and delivering on our devolution agenda. And that's about making sure, of course, for independent review, that we try to get the best possible outcome in the context of a very difficult inheritance. But even with whatever the outcome, that we make sure that it gets to the places that need it most as quickly as possible, laying the ground then for the multi-year settlement that will follow. And that's about giving certainty, but also trust, and having that localism strand running right throughout it. So ending these kind of disparate pots of money that councils are expected to bid into, or even that's included in your core spending power. Still hundreds of lines of different grants that come from different parts of government. Taking away those ring fence and the shackles that councils can actually get on and do the job they've been elected to do. For many councils, will be liberating. And in the end, it's better for public service, but it's almost more important in a way to break the central machine to change that dependency role, so you are far more than creating a relationship of equals. Outside of that, we are determined to get the fit, legal and decent part of local government right too. Finance is part of it, but honestly the structure of local government has been allowed to deteriorate. When we think about, and I know we might have a view about this from SITFA, but the local government audit market and just how much we've allowed backlog to build up and build up. Now there will be significant qualifications that come with that. The consequences, we can't set the national accounts because the local government accounts can't be reconciled. It's going to take time to work through those, but it is part of getting the foundations right so that we can give Treasury confidence that we're getting the financial house in order. And then the final point I'll make, which is a point I make quite often in government, is the thing with local government is because it's essentially an institution of the place and the people. It's not the government actually, it's a place and the community. You always end up paying one way or the other. You pay at the front end through fair distribution, through adequate funding for services, or you pay at the back end because you have system failure that in the end you have to catch up with anyway. Now far better that we don't repeat the mistakes of the last 14 years and we start to get ahead. And the way of getting ahead is freeing up capacity, making sure that there is funding based on need, and also that reform is significantly part of the agenda, which is not an afterthought in the way that it often can be.
Cool, thank you, Jim. Lots to shoot over there. Lots we can pick up in the Q&A, I'm sure. Bev, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, so great to be here. I think kind of great to be talking about English devolution, particularly in the context of not just local government, but local places. And I suppose I want to start by setting us the challenge that when we talk about public services, we need to think about all of those services that happen in a place. And I think that's what's particularly exciting about some of the conversations that Jim's been having around how we can actually reform what services are available to people, what services do for people on a local footprint, which is certainly a conversation that we haven't been having over the last number of years. I want to really just talk a little bit around the context that we in local government find ourselves at the moment, some of the opportunities that arise from that, but also some of the broader opportunities that really can improve our places through devolution and enhanced powers. So from a Manchester perspective, we've obviously been at the forefront with GM colleagues around asking for more power and more control to flow into our city region. And for context, we are still, even with some of the powers that have flowed into city regions and combined authorities, one of the most centralised countries in the OECD. So let's not take Greater Manchester and West Midlands as the benchmark of success when it comes to devolution. It's fair to say that only a fraction of the powers and the control that we sought from central government had ever been delivered under the last government. There's still a lot more to do. I want to frame it really though from the opportunity of residents interacting with services in a place. I, as a council leader, don't see myself as someone who just runs an organisation. I see myself as a convener of place, and if I think back to some of the innovations that have been made, be that around health and social care integration that we led on in Greater Manchester ahead of some of the legislation that was brought in fairly recently, which some might say has helped, some might say has stifled integration. But that was because we set a very simple case that actually spend that happens in social care and spend that happens in the NHS ultimately comes from the same pot and serves the same group of people. And we often talk about NHS and local government not getting on, but pre-COVID we'd got to a situation where we were able to negotiate with the NHS that actually the more they invested in care homes, the more they invested in helping people that received home care have high quality services, the more money that they saved down the line when they looked at admissions to A&E in particular cohorts. So there are lots of practical examples of places that have been cracking on with it. I want to just touch a few examples really in the prevention agenda, because that to me, when we talk about public sector reform, I'm not talking about the reorganisation of services for its own sake. I'm talking about how you genuinely get upstream and make some of those differences. And if I reflect on the situation that we've faced in Manchester with reducing budgets and increased demand over the course of the last 14 to 15 years, for context, 15 years ago we were a city of 400,000, we're now a city of over 600,000. Our local authority budget has decreased by the equivalent of £443 million this year as to what it would have been had growth continued on its trajectory in 2010. But despite all of that, I'm not going to tell you the traditional local government tale of gloom. I'm going to talk to you about some of the good examples of how we've brought services together that I think can offer a blueprint when we talk about the reform of public services and devolution. So firstly, around early help and prevention and supporting families. We took a decision early on that we wanted to protect the best legacies of the last Labour government in the form of Sure Start and do everything that we could to make sure that services worked for people in a place. And we see 100% of our families that are referred through our supported families early help pathways going on to have reduced needs as a consequence. And that's reduced need across a range of complex issues, from domestic violence and abuse to alcohol addiction through to needs in homelessness. In transformation of adult social care, our Better Outcomes, Better Lives programme, bringing together healthcare and community prevention, means that 60% of residents that experience reablement services as they leave hospital don't need further home care or being admitted to a residential or nursing home. That's not rationing of services, that's preventing people and helping them live better lives. The final example I'll give is one on homelessness and TA. And it's a panel that we talked about earlier on this afternoon actually, where we talked about the crisis facing many councils but many families living in temporary accommodation. Across a backdrop of a national increase of 13% rise in families experiencing and having to go through the temporary accommodation service, Manchester last year managed to reduce that from 3,300 families to 2,800 families, and actually eradicating the use of B&Bs. We went from being a net exporter of vulnerable families across the city region, across the northwest of England, to having other local authorities using our services. And the reason I throw all of these examples at you is that if this is what we can do in the context of day-to-day business, with limited support from government, with limited changes around national policy framework and really tight budgets, just imagine what you can do when you can join those services together. The quality and the impact across wider geographical regions, but also more power and control. The final example I give is one of the reasons why in Greater Manchester we bang on so consistently around employment and support services that are currently delivered via job centres and DWP. We ran some really exciting boot camps in the city region around getting people that were falling out of the labour market, skilled up and into the tech sector. We found a really good example of that. Gosh, people aren't really taking us up on this offer of free training. They turned out that they couldn't afford the bus fare, so we offered, as you would expect a local authority in a city region to do, offered to pay the bus fare and offer them a free lunch. They were told by the benefits advisors that they couldn't accept the bus fare and they couldn't accept the free lunch because it would impact on the receipt of universal credit. Now, if you want one simple example around what it means to devolve power, control and resource, it's practical things like that. People like me, in places like mine, know the best answers to some of the biggest, deepest problems that we have. So we have to talk about public services when we talk about devolution.
Brilliant, thank you. That was great. Carol, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, thank you. I'm really pleased to hear both Jim and Bev talk about services in place because that is really important. I have to say, I've been a big fan of devolution for donkey's years. I used to look fondly to the rest of Europe when we were part of Europe, at their regionalisation and to have had that sort of, localism almost, albeit they were still big, but that localism that there was in the rest of Europe. And at that time, I'm talking a few years ago, there was no combined authorities, etc. In West Yorkshire, we've had combined authority arrangements for about 10 years now, though our current mayor, Tracy Brabin, was only elected 3 years ago. It took us a long time to agree those arrangements with the government because we were really quite clear that we wanted to make sure that the leaders of place in West Yorkshire did actually have a voice at that table alongside an elected mayor. And we finally got there. It took a lot of negotiation, but we did finally get there, and we are now, I would say, not 1 plus 5, i.e. the mayor plus 5 leaders. We are 6 leaders of place within West Yorkshire. We are working together, and that's something else that Jim was talking about, collaboration, recognising that local authorities are the delivery arm, and that getting the financial foundations right as well. I mean, that is just so important, as Bev has actually not alluded to, but pointed out as well. But the regionalisation or further devolution does give us that opportunity to really work now. It's been my mantra since the general election. We've got a Labour government, we've got a Labour mayor, we've got 4.5 Labour MPs in West Yorkshire, sorry about that, the half, and we've got 5 Labour administrations in West Yorkshire as well. So that collaboration, what we can really do together now is really important. The government can't do it on its own. The combined authority can't do it on its own. As much as Tracy Braden's mantra is deliver, 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 local authorities are that delivery agent for the combined authority in so many different cases. So it's really important that our local growth plans at a local level, very local, that do feed into or are up one with the West Yorkshire local growth plan, along with the government as well. We have to work in with that synergy and that collaboration. There is, well, just to give some examples again as well, in terms of how local authorities are that delivery arm. I have to say that without the help of the combined authority, and I mean without it, we're doing so much anyway. Just think again, as Bev said, what we can do if we did. I mean, in Kirklees, we are spending £250 million on redesigning the whole of Huddersfield Town Centre called the Cultural Heart. We are spending another 60 to 80 million on Dewsbury Town Centre. We're building 2,000 houses in Dewsbury at Riverside. We've also got, which is really important to us, the Transpennine rail upgrade, the biggest transport project in the country at the moment, and that is just so important, giving us the link from Manchester through to Leeds and other places, but going right through the heart of Kirklees and Huddersfield at the same time. And all that actually is independent of the combined authority. But just think how we can work together and the differences that that could make. But what we have at the moment, in terms of public services, I mean, transport is on a different plane. It's obviously very strategic and things do happen at that national and regional level, but it has to still meet the needs of a local area. I mean, Kirklees is a large local area geographically, and we have got really important links that go into Leeds, that go into Manchester, but we also link up with Sheffield, and we've got a really poor service, be it road or rail or bus into Sheffield from Huddersfield. It can take you 2 hours on the train. I mean, we could really do, Jim, with the levelling up money that we put in to upgrade the Pennine line. But transport's on one plane. Health is another thing, isn't it? I mean, health authorities or the ICBs, they actually haven't got the public accountability that local authorities or combined authorities have got, or the government certainly, at the moment. That there needs to be that accountability. I mean, at all levels, we are actually talking of the point of devolution is actually getting people in their places, in their communities, being able to describe what it is they want, they need, and then us delivering it for them. Be it, say, local authorities, combined authority, the health authority. But there isn't that accountability at the moment for health. And then something like, I mean, of course now we're talking about planning and housing. Where does that best sit? I'm not sure that I can completely agree with the government saying that we need to take control or we need to reform planning to get houses built. I mean, I think there's a difference between north and south of the country. I mean, certainly we've given in Kirklees, planning permission beyond immeasurably, and nothing happens, because the developers sit on the land, as we all know. We're not a blocker on the whole in West Yorkshire in terms of planning, but I mean, if it's devolved to combined authorities or what is devolved to combined authorities? It's obviously not the nitty-gritty of somebody's porch being built on the outside of their house. It has to be far more strategic, and that will be good. I mean, we can really see how that strategic work is needed. But having said that, certainly within West Yorkshire, we're very good at actually talking across boundaries and having collaboration with our neighbouring authorities when it comes to our local plan and to our planning. So I think there's a lot of discussion still to be had in terms of our planning and obviously housing. We need housing. How do we get it built? And it's not, I say, planning that's the barrier for us. So, and then finally, I mean, it does have to, I think as everyone's been said, that we do have to make sure the voice of the communities is heard in all of this, and to find structures that can enable that. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we were so keen to make sure the leaders of West Yorkshire were at the table with the mayor, because we felt that there had to be some directly elected representative somehow within the combined authority structure. That still needs to be there. It needs to be, I don't want to go back down to parish councils, but we have to make sure that the voices of local communities are heard. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Karen. Ian, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Ben. It's always a bit nerve-wracking going last time. Quite well. So I'm Ian Murray. I'm the Director of Public Financial Management at SIPFA, and some of you will have heard SIPFA, some of you may not have done, but we're an international accounting and membership body, and lots of our members will be working in finance teams across public service, finance leaders. We're very interested in particularly English local government, because frankly we set lots of the rules that they have to follow day to day. I'm going to beg a little small indulgence, and then I'll make some points. And apologies to Ben, because he's heard me say this at least once before. So I'd like to take you all back to the 12th of September 1912. Winston Churchill was giving a speech at a meeting organised by the Dundee's Women Liberal Foundation. And the contentious topic of the day is actually Irish Home Rule. And he's frequently interrupted by suffragettes, so I'm sure Rachel Reeves would have some sympathy today based on what happened over in the main hall. And actually he's has to pause a number of times whilst people are ejected from the room. But in between those interruptions, what he sets out is a vision for a federalised United Kingdom, and he talks about establishing 10 or 12 separate legislatures across the United Kingdom, discharging the functions entrusted to them by Parliament, and these include, I think topically, Lancashire, Yorkshire, the Midlands, and obviously London. And I don't have a passable Churchill impression, but he says, the prospect, I'm bound to say, does not seem extravagant to me. The vision does not seem to me at all disquieting. After all, we may be very little islands, but we have very large population, and the affairs of 45 millions of persons demand far closer attention and far more intimate knowledge than they can possibly achieve from one imperial parliament. So even the arch-imperialist Churchill was a fan of devolution, at least when it suited him. In all seriousness, I think what this points to is this tension between centralisation and decentralisation it's a core part of our political discourse that goes back decades. And that seems surprising then that we've persisted with a centralist model. If there's a wide acknowledgement that, it's nearer 70 million people now, but if there's a wide acknowledgement that actually the best outcomes can be delivered by those people who are more closely connected to their place, it seems a shame really that we've not managed to realise some of those opportunities hitherto. So at SIPFA we're supportive of a rational and principled approach to devolution. And I hope we echo what's been said this afternoon already by other panellists. It's really important that this is an opportunity to do that across public services, that it doesn't just become a local government conversation. I I think local government's an incredibly important part of that, but we can't miss that opportunity. And to echo what others have said, we really are an international outlier. Certainly the work we do globally, you'd be surprised at how centralised things are here in the UK. So what needs to be different, I suppose, to try and achieve some of those outcomes? And again, encouraged by some of the things that have already been said this afternoon. So it does require a mindset change. This is something that's hard baked into the way that we do business in this country through political services. So I think it's really important that central government will need to approach this in a way that local public service providers are seen as equal partners, and they're engaged at the outset in a way that essentially maybe hasn't happened previously. So engaging local partners as you're developing policy, not just when you're thinking about implementing policy, would make a huge, huge difference. Equally, local government and local public sector partners are going to need to acknowledge that if you're going to get more powers, if you're going to see changes in funding, well, it's totally reasonable that that comes with some expectations around accountability, assurance, and those sorts of things. Yeah, and I think that the point about local audit is a good example actually of where lots of the mechanisms that should be keeping local authorities on the straight and narrow just aren't there or aren't operating in the way that they need to at the moment. And I suppose most importantly, it's about how you pull all of that together so you're delivering outcomes which tie into an overarching national vision. So devolution is a really exciting opportunity for us to look at doing that. But a mindset shift won't be enough. I think good intentions and spirit of partnership are a really good starter for 10. But actually, if you look at quite how heavily siloed the way that we deliver public services are in this country at the moment, and if you look at some of the frameworks and some of the disincentives that are created as barriers, we need to also address that. And it's those structural issues, I think, which aren't just at a local level. So I think it's interesting. You often see more trust between local partners within a place, and I think there's less trust between those paymasters, shall we say, within Whitehall. So some of what needs to happen in devolution is not necessarily about what happens in place. It's actually reform of what happens in Whitehall. And I think then the final point, because I'm sure we want to open up to questions, is thinking about. So one of the things we've been reflecting on is we talk a lot about spend. So we talk a lot about how we spend money, and particularly in the operating context that not just local authorities but actually all bits of the public service are in at the moment. It's very much about hand-to-mouth existence. How do you spend money to frankly meet increasing demands? I think these conversations give us an opportunity to start thinking about how we invest in public services, and actually public services are a really key part of a growing economy, of a society that we would all choose to be part of. So I think there's it's semantics perhaps, but I think there's that mindset shift, which is not just okay, how do we spend money to meet the existing demand? Actually, what are the outcomes we want to deliver, and how do we put ourselves in the best possible place to do that? And I suppose just thinking about what that might look like. At the moment, we focus a lot on who is delivering what in terms of public service provision, and we don't often ask ourselves the question how, and more important, we don't really ask ourselves the question why. And I think if we could start to bring some of those questions into the conversation, we'd probably find that we end up with some much better outcomes than what we're able to deliver.
Cool, thank you, Ian. I was going to say, before we open it up to the floor, does anyone on the panel want to come back on anything they've heard? Jim, do you want to come back on any of the discussion?
I feel in a way we're slightly broadly on the same page. I think almost like the test, Carol, that you were applying in terms of, I think quite rightly, when we were wrestling with this in Greater Manchester about how do you maintain the sovereignty and what makes a local council special, that doesn't essentially kind of create a command authority that has to justify its own existence, because government actually haven't met us halfway with all powers, so we have to justify this new being that we've created. And I do think that is an inherent risk. I suppose the question, and this will be a challenge for us on the English devolution bill, is to not quite raise the stakes, it's not quite the right way of framing it, but at least to require mayors to look national as well as local. And where I do think there's a gap, and I should say from the outset, what we're trying to do in creating the Council of Nations and Regions and putting England on par with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland is to get our mayors to be our national leaders of England and to move as a collective, and then to work in unison across our pan regions, where we do need to have more ground. There's not policy, there's work to do and the rest of it. But you could easily imagine a situation, of course, where local planning decisions are not taken up by a combined authority, but there is a recognition that we need to have better government approach to land use. You know, you've got competing interests around onshore energy, on food use, on water security, on transport, on housing, and a range of other priorities on justice and prison spaces and all nuclear, all these other issues are kind of playing out a very actually limited land resource. That's where you get the way in nature and quality of life and national parks and the rest of it. Actually, a regional, pan-regional footprint for that type of spatial planning, there's not a new idea. It was originally what Transport for the North was intended to be when it was set up as a statutory authority that was eventually diluted and ended up being almost like a lobbying body. And so we've kind of been here before, we've gone close towards it, and then we kind of back off. And I think almost this is just, if it's a good idea, should just try and see it through and see if it works or not. Because the way we're doing it now doesn't work in terms of growth, in terms of people feeling connected. And I think if we do that, I'm hoping that it will get around the issues that are legitimate about councils feeling as though this is a dilution of what makes councils special and what makes them more effective at delivering local services above and beyond central government.
Yeah, actually I wanted to pick up on something that Ian actually, a word that he actually used in response to yourself, Jim, and that's trust. I mean, you say, what's the risk? Well, yes, where there's a risk, it's a risk, but you're going to have to trust, or we're going to have to trust everybody. We've got to trust the combined authority and government. The government has got to trust the combined authority and local authorities to do what is needed. And I think that's really, that is really important. The PAN region is also really very important. I mean, as I just mentioned, I mean, the Trans-Pennine rail upgrade, I mean, that is a perfect example of a pan regional project, which, I mean, is driven actually by government at the moment, I mean, or Network Rail or whoever, but yeah, we could do so much more, and we have to recognise that we're not alone. I mean, West Yorkshire is not an island, nor is Greater Manchester, or any other combined authority for that matter, and yes, we need to work together. Yeah.
And I guess by international standards, we're very geographically close to each other. So when we go and we do trade visits, be it to North America, be it to Japan, actually having Liverpool, Manchester, Bradford, Leeds, Huddersfield, having so many towns and cities so close together is a massive economic opportunity for the North of England. And I do want to just talk a little bit on that relational trust point actually, because it's probably one of the things that Jim will know from his own experience in Greater Manchester, that as part of devolution, but also part of any kind of breaking down of silos, that relational trust has to be there. I think you can build some of that in with the model that you choose. So, I'm a big fan of the combined authority model. Andy won't mind me describing him as the captain of a football team, but he's not that singles tennis player that gets out and dictates his own game, because he's got to have the rest of the system work with him to achieve his aim. And I think there is something quite unique in having all bits of the system move together. But the same stands for other public sector institutions that don't currently have the duty upon them to cooperate in that local place. And I think we need to think about and reflect on our experience of working with the many previous governments that have existed over the last 14 years, is that actually kind of stepping outside of what is now the territory of the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government was always the hard bit. So it can't be the case that I'm embarking on one of the largest urban regeneration projects in England at Victoria North. We're building 15,000 new homes across 7 new neighbourhoods, New River City Park, but I have to wait until there's 15,000 people live there and they have their kids before we get to have that conversation with the Department of Education and the Department of Health around getting a GP surgery and getting a school. And suddenly by that point the crisis has hit you because you're oversubscribed for your public services. So I think it's probably less about the place and more about thinking about the other departments that operate across government and what the opportunity is for them to have benefit and impact in places, and those are the conversations we need to start to break down.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this is overstating something to prove the point. I think if you look at local government is a fantastic vehicle for delivery of central government policy and has been and actually has continued to do that against the backdrop of real-term cuts in funding, etc., etc. Now we are at a point where we're not just creaking at the knees. It's one of the things local government can be guilty of sometimes as a result of that is it feels it has to solve all of the problems for everybody. It's just give us more, give us more, give us more. And actually, I think if you go into those conversations with that trust, it's not just about yes, we could do more. It's also about actually there would be some things where it would be good if we ceded control of that, or we don't need to do this bit anymore because maybe we're not best placed to do it, or actually we trust our partners in this other, to be able to do that well enough for us that it doesn't. So I think it's that adult to adult conversation that we kind of need to have, and I think it happens. It probably happens in quite a piecemeal fashion at the moment, and I suppose that's maybe where one of the opportunities with something like the sort of Council of Nations and Regions is, well, you're creating a space where you can convene those conversations so that if there are outcomes you want to deliver, you can think through the implications of all of those before you start to deliver, before you put the policy into place, rather than a lot of wisdom after the event.
Just on that point, this is why building out in England is so important, and we do have lots of conversations where, for very understandable reasons and some very legitimate reasons, council leaders, councillors will say, a mayor isn't quite right for us, it's not quite right, it's not our identity, it's not our history, it doesn't speak to the type of place where we are. And it is a bit like saying, well, an MP doesn't quite work here, or a councillor doesn't quite work here, we're a bit unique. Of course, it can work, and it can be made to work. And if you want to break that centralised model of Whitehall needing a system to run in parallel, you've got to break the need for that unit to exist. And the only way to break the need for that unit to exist is to make sure that every part of England is able to run its own affairs. If you don't do that, you're always going to need Whitehall to provide a function for the great bits of the map that haven't got a default settlement to send it down to. So this is critical, not just for that kind of democratic voice for the north of England or the Midlands or wherever you are. It's actually pretty essential for the future of good public services and where they're marshalled from.
Cool. We're going to take some questions. Get your hands in the air. Wow, look at that. We'll take two. We'll go 1, 2. Perfect.
Hi, James here from the District Councils Network. Is the English devolution bill a chance to take a proper look at fiscal devolution, give local places genuine new powers to raise income locally, retain it locally, and can devolution really succeed without that? Can we really say that we've broken the stranglehold of Whitehall without fiscal devolution?
Thanks. I'm Grace Duffy from Bridges Outcomes Partnerships. And actually, not a dissimilar question, because I was thinking really, the sort of 3-year budget settlements for local authorities and block grants for combined authorities, great idea. It's very sort of necessary, but I feel like quite far from sufficient reforms to really deal with, effective funding of services. And I think there probably much greater flexibility, perhaps in the form of fiscal devolution, but perhaps other sorts of flexibility is going to be required to really actually invest in preventative services, and perhaps a broader conception of what we think of statutory services, right? So children's services is a really good example. We've just had a commissioner not recommission a service which is early intervention, keeping children out of care, because they need to spend all of that money on the care homes, and they know that this is a nonsensical use of their funding, and yet they're obliged to do so. So I guess the questions are for sort of Bev and Carol, what is the flexibility that you need to be able to do more of that, invest to save, and more of that upstream kind of prevention? I guess for Ian, it's surely there's flexibility in accounting reasons that can be done, or not reasons necessarily to support that. And for Jim, what are the options that government are considering to give that kind of flexibility in accounting for prevention in a different way? So loads of questions.
Loads of questions, great. So questions from Grace around flexibility, members of the panel. Question from James on fiscal devolution, which we haven't talked about thus far, but has been put onto the table very boldly. So yeah, who wants to kick us off on the easy question of fiscal devolution? Anybody? Or the flexibility one?
I can tell you what we're actively looking at. At the moment, the immediacy is stopping council going under now. And so we're committed to, and the work is being done on a multi-year settlement that will take place after the first kind of 1 year emergency response. And that will talk about redistribution, will talk about targeting the money where it's most needed. That will naturally have to take into account areas with low tax bases that have done everything they can do and they can't sweat it any more than they have done in terms of the impact on households, income, etc. So, and that's news to nobody because everyone recognises that's basically the system. Your ability to move money around the system is so limited, really. We're talking about headline on business rates and a bit of other grant. The trick more, I think, is how do you, it kind of comes down to kind of what's the core defining core services, really. In this new kind of constitutional relationship, what is the core business of a local authority and what are the expectations of central government? And how do we have a framework for that that isn't 2,000 different indicators or reporting mechanisms or evaluation processes, where we are far more outcome-based really than output-based is where we're trying to get to. Now that will require a lot of work with the Department for Education, the Department for Health, DPP and other people to try and have that conversation. I would say early conversations are very, very positive. My job is made a lot easier. One, that the Prime Minister gets reform a lot and cares about it and knows it will make a difference, and you will hear him talk about we need to reform public services to bring the future, but also individual departments get it, and there's a lot of work taking place on that. On the fiscal devolution, which is always a question that I'm very happy to say is above my pay grade, I think there's some lower hanging fruit than others. But in the end, I would say that's going to, in the end, be quite marginal for most places. You talk, and might as well kind of have no elephants in the room. If you think about a tourism tax or an overnight accommodation tax, it's a very kind of simple argument to make in terms of you will pay it in most places. People are quite used to it. It doesn't affect the resident population, so you're not going to get voted out of office, etc., etc. Quite a lot going for it, and that may well be something that does come. Who knows? However. That does not address the financial stability of most councils in most places fundamentally. Because what you come down to is the local tax base that is inherited by most, any individual council leader, and including myself when I was there, you get what you inherited. And what you inherit are generations or centuries of a tax base on your resident population and your business rate population. And if both of those are weakened, you can do a lot. And you know, Manchester actually has shown that with the City region. West Yorkshire have shown that too. You can do a lot actually with local leadership, but you can still only take it so far because there are always going to be limitations. And I only say that because it can be quite easy in this job to defer to Treasury and say, you know, is Treasury the problem? I don't think they are. I think they have a real difficulty with saying if there are competing interests here. We get very loud voices saying you've got to redistribute and get money to where it's needed. But then we get the same light voices saying, by the way, take away any HMT flexibility to create a centralised pot to distribute from. And in there is a tension, basically. But we're alive to the competing demand, and we're trying to navigate it.
Very well handled, yeah, I must say.
And we did get asked about fiscal devolution a lot, and I think it means a lot of different things to different people. And I think we've obviously in Manchester tried to grow our tax base as best we can. We know that a 1% rise in our council tax will deliver approximately 1.2 million to Surrey's 7 million. So actually we come from a very different starting point, but we also know that growing our city centre from a population of 800 people to 80,000 people increases the council tax base, and growing the number of businesses that we have in the city and the city region, particularly having negotiated business rate retention, incentivises growth. So I think there are things that you can do within the system that incentivises places actually overreaching, to your point around what local government is there for, because actually if my predecessors hadn't decided that they were place and city leaders rather than council leaders, then the transformation of Manchester's economy simply wouldn't have happened. And we would still be a city where 25% of our residents got no formal skills or qualifications, unemployment levels were high, and people left the city rather than attracted to it. So sometimes overreach in local government is helpful. I think to your point just on what we need to get better upstream, we do find ourselves making the financial business case quite frequently. I think my plea would be is that it's easy when you're doing that in-house than it is across wider public services. So I know I've got plenty of examples where I can save money for the criminal justice system, I could save money for the NHS, I could save money for DWP, but the business case that I would pitch and that I would accept from my own officers to invest money, to save like I've done with preventative services that I referenced earlier, probably wouldn't translate across government. So I think the plea is actually it's the public purse that spends. The more we can transfer business cases across the public purse to save public pennies, I think the better.
Just on that point, I think one kind of, if you believe in reform, place-based reform, Georgia Gould, former leader of Camden, is leading that from the Cabinet Office, and we're working in partnership with our department to really look at that. We had a session in Manchester actually with leaders a couple of weeks ago to explore how we can make this a reality. So you are seeing, I think, a lot of kind of cross-government work in the other days. To be fair, only 3 months in. It's a blur. Where we are. But the spirit of cooperation in these areas that were kind of fringe issues by and large, weren't they? And now kind of central to delivering on the mission, which I think is quite exciting.
Yeah,
Just
just
the panel anything?
yes. I mean, some flexibility would be absolutely wonderful. Invest to save would be absolutely wonderful. We can invest to save at the moment where we can spend capital, which will eventually save revenue. And as far as we're building special schools, children's homes within our area, so as to save money in terms of in the long run anyway, of sending children outside of the area and keeping them within our own public services. And that's an invest to save, but that's saving, that's spending on capital. And certainly the capital that we're putting into the regeneration of our town centres as well, that's about invest to save. But it's only capital. We really need the revenue to follow suit and to obviously to prop it up, but also then to follow suit to make the most of it. That would to be able to do that on a more coherent basis would be absolutely wonderful. But we do need that fair funding more than anything else, really, as Jim has been saying, and as Bev. We are a very low tax base. We cannot raise much more than £1 million from our houses and our residents and our businesses, from council tax or business rates. It doesn't go very far, and it's a spiral almost. I mean, because it's low to start with, it never gets any higher. Yeah, that fair funding is far more important, really, to be honest, than anything at the moment.
Yeah.
So I think fiscal devolution, I think, is probably a sensible long-term goal. I think there are probably some things you could look at more immediately. I agree kind of around it. I think tourist taxes is an example where, yes, you could generate some pots of money, but it doesn't, it's in the margins. I think one of the reflections we've had certainly is that local authorities were given the wrong set of freedoms to go and borrow money cheaply and do kind of commercial type things, when actually things like, there isn't a full cost recovery model for planning. There are fees and charges. There are all sorts of markets that local authorities understand really, really well because they're in them day in, day out, and some freedoms in those areas actually, it wouldn't solve the problems, but it would make some of those things a bit easier. I think business rates and council tax, I think we'd all agree, we would suggest that they're pretty poor taxes in terms of and so if you're looking at fiscal devolution, you probably want to look at different models for raising, in terms of how you would do it. My favourite council tax.
Pictures to the chance.
Well, my favourite council tax is we do international studies laws. I had a group from Mongolia in our offices in London a few months ago. They were from local tax offices, and he was speaking through a translator, and we said, your council tax is based on what your house would have been worth in 1991. They all stopped the translator and said, no, you've mistranslated that. She queried, I said, no, yes, 1991, and they all burst into laughter. So I think there's the other things that a lot of those they're quite flawed, and we haven't kept them up to date. The same is true with business rates. So I think sometimes it's to what extent do we try and play around the edges with the things that we've already got, or to what extent do you actually go back and have some first principle conversations?
But in the end, you know, to just manage expectations, that there is no review of council tax taking place. Partly because we have committed to reviewing business rates, and we are on with that to make sure that business rates are driving growth rather than being a barrier to it.
Yeah.
But with council tax, I think everyone agrees that it's a terrible tax, but it's probably the best you've got. Because the alternatives in terms of the consequences of it, when you plan them through, in terms of households, I mean, households now are more complicated than were in 91 when the houses were revalued. My 22-year-old son is still at home. You know, people are staying home longer if you move into some kind of income tax type system, which is, you know, often the Dems were kind of income tax focused at one point. You are getting to the territory of an uneasy political messaging on that. So it's understood, it's easy to collect. It definitely has wild geographical variations. The question for Treasury will always be, in areas with low tax bases, have you got enough movement in the system to be able to accommodate for that or not? And what's happened over the last decade is that the government has incrementally and quite robustly taken money away through the area-based grant in areas with low tax bases and give it straight across as a rural service delivery grant to rural shires who are better funded in terms of their tax bases. That's a matter of fact, that's where the evidence points to. And that's that. So the equalisation that would have been there as a safety net has been completely taken away at a point where demand in those areas has gone through the roof, and we end up with a collapse of councils on the back end. There'll always be extremes. You're always going to get a council that will do something silly, like you always get a government that will do something silly. There's no council that's done anything sillier than this trusted to the country. So we should hold council to a higher standard than the government. So you've got to kind of bear that in mind. But for most councils in most financial distress at this point in time, it's not recklessness, it's not over borrowing, it's that they just cannot keep ahead with demand in those key areas. And government has got to have an answer for that.
I think for what it's worth, we'd start with business rates as well. I think if you council tax is almost the bit at the end, like it's the bit at the end that councils can kind of, and I think if you're looking at those core funding streams, those are the things you kind of, is where you start to look at how to make a difference.
We started a couple of minutes late. I'm going to run over by 2 to 3 minutes if that's okay. People need to really understand. We'll take 3 questions just because everyone's waiting very patiently. Jake, my favourite, my best colleagues are not, the panel is great. We're going to go to the lady there and then the hand at the back. Sorry. Did you see that or not, Hannah?
Yeah. That's brilliant.
Jake, over to you.
Thanks for what's been said. I suppose in the devolution bill, I've worked currently in City Council as a former special advisor in the Brown government in CLG as it was then. Worked in local authority, very close to those. I was going to say, on the devolution bill, I suppose what we need is TfL style transport systems in all our cities. And so are we going to be able to advance that through the devolution bill and other areas as well to enable that to happen? Because that is actually key for economic growth. You know, the Demos event and the Demos work on the universal work service, I think, is very interesting on how that can happen in where we are in the West Midlands. You know, I think one of the absolutely critical, you know, the devolution of DWP to enable that and to much more degree, so is absolutely key. So there's big things like that that are needed, but equally for local authorities there's a whole raft of other measures and flexibilities that would be great. And I just worry that if that's not captured in the devolution programme as well, because it tends to be the conversation at the kind of authority level, but there's lots of, for example, place powers that local authorities could utilise to tackle lots of different areas, and things like permitted development rights have been allowed, which was created for quality housing, etc., etc. So there's quite a raft of things on the sort of small level, but then also the bigger level that would be useful to be cracked.
Cool, thank you, Jake. The hand at the back, I don't really see whose hand it was, if I'm honest. It was the back row, yeah, the gentleman in the back row, and then the lady to the left in front, yeah.
Good afternoon. I wanted to make an observation about 2 of the points were made very early on. And there was one point made about the DWP and the way that conducted itself. And I think we're all aware about the way they treated carers. But I think the abuse of claimants is across the board. And it was formerly the Department of Safety and Security. And I think that's been lost So as a matter of social justice, that needs remedying. And I know from my own work in the homelessness domain that you cannot remunerate people for their voluntary work and lived experience work. Well, the government claims to want to do that. They then say it will screw up your benefits. So we never resolve that. That's going to be resolved in my 10 years experience in that domain. And the next point was, going back to my previous incarnation as a management accountant, you mentioned audit. Now, again, I'm being cynical, but this is accurate. In my experience, company directors who are extremely, well, on the whole, pretty well paid, regard any form of payment of tax, be it corporation or income tax, as something they're not getting a return on because they don't meet what the state provides them. So they'll contrive not to pay it. If we had audit arrangements for every single company where they all paid something on some sort of formula to do with profits or turnover or number of staff, and we actually clamp down on that, perhaps the National Audit Office could lead on that, rather than actually the auditors being the same people prepare the accounts. There's a conflict of interest there. I think we could actually resolve a lot of the financial problems very, very easily. And that was my second point.
Cool. Thank you. And then to the lady just in front. Keep the question short as we can go.
Yeah, I'm Gemma, I work for London Councils. My question was about employment and skills devolution. That's something we're really interested in sort of broadening out in London. I know you've touched on it a little bit, but could you say more about where you think the prizes are when it comes to the employment and skills system, and what your views are on where local government could go with that partners?
Cool. Anyone want to kick us off? This is probably your final chance to say anything.
Well, I've got another panel to do,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
if I do the response, in terms of kind of what powers, whether it's transport or any other, ahead of the devolution bill, we are inviting submissions on what type of power should be in place, and we've committed with the LJ, County Council Network, District Council Network, and others to co-produce on this as much as we can do. So we are really keen to make sure that we deal with some of this. And also, let's find, we should be using the primary legislation. It's quite rare to get it. It's going to be a big vehicle, and we should use it. Now, the art of the possible is we'll have to work through the system. But my observations are we have created an architecture of government and interrelationship that is very, very parent-child. Where my ministerial inbox of a couple of hundred sign-offs in a given week will go from anything from the £360 billion local government pension scheme, largest public sector scheme in the country, 7th largest in the world, and whether a parish council can have a no bank policy in the local park. And there is something quite wrong about that balance of the relationship, where even on something that your community wants, where you've been through a process and you want to make progress, you are required to get agreement from the Secretary of State. Having some conversations beyond structural devolution from combined authority, etc., to actually the role and the powers of a local authority, in the spirit of the powers of general competence or well-being or whatever, and then the role of the Department of Secretary of State to that relationship, I think should be part of the conversation. Where it ends up, let's see on some of that. DWP, the council leads will be able to go on about this a lot, because I know it's a significant part of both the opportunity and the risk of delivering some of that kind of societal change. Probably at some point we need to decide what these places are. Are they places to get people back to work and also to support people in sustaining work, to upskill and have sustained careers, or are they processing centres of benefits or entitlement or whatever? And it feels to me as though, depending on the government, or even depending on the Secretary of State and the government, they slightly change tone, culture, approach, and the rest of it. And it's local councils who are trying to fill in the gap here. It was a long time ago now, but part of the kind of Greater Manchester devolution, so a long time ago. There's a stat that really stood out for me. I don't know the source of it, so don't quote it. But it was something like 80% of people who are unemployed present to the job centre, where only 20% of jobs are ever advertised. So the disconnect between the unemployment pool and the job availability. Why? Because most people get a job through their friends, family, their networks, word of mouth, contacts, and the rest of it, in a way that is disconnected from the job centre. When I was at last school, it was a little postcards that you used to have to go and read. It's not that anymore. And the final thing for me would just be about where we can make on the skills agenda. Some Greater Manchester doing this, is it the MPAC it's called, the kind of the project about apprenticeships, but it's essentially my lived experience is always the best, but when I left school, it would have been 15, so you finish your exams and then you kind of go out into the real world. I had to wait from the June, July to the April the year after to get an apprenticeship as a technician. My son, who's 22, so fast forward 20 years, left school again in the June, July, and he had to wait till November to find a placement. His girlfriend, same age, has got plenty of options for a college placement for a dental hygienist. And you can get free offers of a placement in the college, but you've got to ring around and find your own job placement because the employment market isn't connected to the schools provider market. And just if you sorted out the alignment with the school half term, so that school leavers had somewhere to go to and a pool of people at the same time, it would take away a lot of stress and anxiety. It'd also be good for the employee to have a single pool to choose from. And frankly, it would also stop all these dentists in Greater Manchester just putting the phone down every 5 minutes and another would-be student is phoning them. But even those practical examples of where it's just not working for working people have to be tackled.
1 minute from everyone else. Beth?
Yes, so really briefly, I don't think I could do skill system justice in a minute. I think there's something for me around employment support, recognising who's best and where's the best place for support to be delivered in the role that not just local authorities but also local services and the voluntary community sector can play. As a proponent of devolution, I actually think there needs to be some national reform around our curriculum. It cannot be the case in a modern tech-enabled society. GCSE IT is the most boring GCSE that exists in the world and kids don't want to do it. So we need some national reform. And we also need to make sure
but very quickly, I mean, I would have said much that Bev was saying in terms of employment and skills, but just on transport systems, we have got, in West Yorkshire anyway, we are looking to have a mass transit system, which hopefully one of these days might rival Manchester, but that's decades off. But I mean, to have a TfL for West Yorkshire would be wonderful.
I don't have got much to add to anyway. To be honest. I think it comes to the point of it comes to the whole argument about subsidiarity, doesn't it? So it's about working out where in a place or where in those structures is best place to deliver to deliver things and not being too precious to acknowledge that sometimes it might not be.
Cool. We ran over a bit. That was great. No more time for questions. I hope everyone's okay. Let's give them a round of applause.